children's moment thing here. Not that I've never done children's moment before, but I've never done it here before, and I don't know the crowd, you know? It's like the toughest crowd. Preaching normal sermons don't stress me out, and then you put a bunch of kids in front of me, and I'm really nervous. So hopefully this goes over better with you than it's going. Will you join me in prayer? God, may the words of my mouth and the meditations of all of our hearts be acceptable to you, our God, our strength and our Redeemer. Amen. So going from Texas to Virginia for college was one of the scariest things I have ever done. My mom and I drove her minivan loaded up with everything I would need for dorm life. Clothes, bedding, books. Quite an assortment of things that I had acquired from Target using the Target gift cards I got from graduation. If you ever walk through Target during back to school season, you'll see some of the weirdest stuff, like why could a college student possibly need this? But anyway, I had all that in the van. And an iced tea maker, which was a really big deal for me and also made me a very popular person on my floor. So after we've carried the boxes up to the 4th floor, and I'd met the complete stranger that I would be living with for the next year, my mom and I stood by her van hugging before she drove away. Amidst all the excitement about college, it hadn't sunk in that at the end of the day, my mom was going to leave. And she was going to be 1,400 miles away with the rest of my family, along with everything else that was familiar to me. Through tears, I told her, "You are abandoning me with a complete stranger." And then through her tears, she reassured me that everything was going to be okay. And then eventually she drove away. And I walked up the 4 flights of stairs to my new home. And after getting to know my roommate and a few other girls on our hallway on the orientation retreat that we went on, I found myself that weekend sprawled out in mine and Christine's room, crowded in with girls. Christine had brought a small TV with her, which seemed really exciting because my parents had said that college was no time to have a TV. You had other important things to do. So Christine had a small TV, and I had all 7 seasons of Gilmore Girls. So between the two of us, we and the other girls on our hallway, we thought there was no better way to spend our first weekend in college than to pop some popcorn and start with season 1. And this became our ritual as weeks went by, hanging out in our room, watching Gilmore Girls. If you've seen the show before, you know the theme song is an adaptation of the classic Carole King song from the 1970s, Where You Lead. Every time a new episode came on, we'd all sing at the top of our lungs, "If you're out on the run, feeling lonely and so cold, all you have to do is call my name and I'll be there on the next train." And then the next part is where we really let it loose. "Where you lead, I will follow anywhere that you tell me to. If you need me to be with you, I will follow where you lead." So Carole King has said that her song was inspired by the Book of Ruth. And if you've heard the whole song, you would also know that it is a song about a romantic relationship. And so often when we hear the scripture verse, that's where we hear it in the context of weddings or romantic love. And it is a really great example of that kind of relationship. I think it really goes deeper than that. And maybe Gilmore Girls, as a TV show about mother-daughter relationships, takes us back a bit to that original context. And in many ways, this song became the theme song for my life during those years. Being far away from home during college as life happened was hard, and I had to create a new family away from home. And those girls would become a part of that, and I'm still am close to them, even though I don't see them as often as I like. And those girls include my friend Maggie, who you guys have heard me talk about probably many times, and I actually participated in her ordination last weekend in North Carolina. I've always really liked the story of Naomi and Ruth. Naomi has faced a lot of changes, many of which she had absolutely no control over. First, she and her husband, along with their sons, have had to leave their home because of famine, taking refuge in a new and unfamiliar place where they are now strangers. There they begin to build their new life together in that new place. Her sons marry local Moabite women, Orpah and Ruth. What had once been unfamiliar and scary now had to be home again. Now began to feel like home again. But then her husband dies unexpectedly. But she still has her two sons. And then the worst happens. Her sons also die, leaving her all alone in a land that so suddenly felt no longer like home. Naomi, feeling defeated and completely abandoned by God, is determined to return to her own land and her own people. She is done with Moab, a place that has not brought her nothing but grief and loneliness. Her newly widowed daughters-in-law try to accompany her, but Naomi, as a widow herself, has nothing to offer them. And a little bit of ancient Israelite humor, which I'm really glad y'all got. It helps me remember that you're still paying attention to what's being read. So in this little bit of ancient Israelite humor, Naomi jokes that she is too old to get married or to even consider having another son because that would have been the custom for a widow to marry the next son in the family. And then, because they wouldn't want to wait for that son to grow up. So in the midst of her loneliness and despair, Naomi is ready for defeat. She feels unworthy and cursed, and she tells them to go. Now Orpah listens to Naomi and returns to her own family. But Ruth stays. And she doesn't just stay. She commits to being with Naomi in the midst of everything going on in her life. And she could have continued her own life, returned to the home of her own family, as Orpah had chose to do. But Naomi and Ruth are family too. As the women of that family group's household, they likely cooked and cleaned together. I imagine Naomi may have helped Ruth with household chores and tasks she didn't quite know how to do yet as a newlywed. And then Ruth may have helped Naomi become connected to other Moabite women or learn new recipes from the local cuisine from Moab. Ruth and Naomi were part of the family, part of a family, although they were different, came from different religions and different cultures. They were family. Ruth and Orpah had other family and friends in the area, and they could have returned to their own lives and just let Naomi disappear. But Ruth stayed. I've always loved this scripture passage, but it wasn't until I did my clinical pastoral education unit at MD Anderson Cancer Center the summer after I did my student ministry here that I discovered this deep, rich meaning of the Ruth and Naomi story. For those of you who have had a long-term illness or have a loved one experience one, you may know what I'm talking about. At the hospital, I saw patient after patient put up walls between themselves and their loved ones, like they were trying to shield them from the pain of watching someone they love in pain. And sometimes they were successful. When we are suffering, it feels natural to push people away or even feel like no one is there at all. In the midst of our own lives, sometimes we can feel isolated from everything and everyone else. But I realized that in the midst of all their pain and suffering, it was those who stayed no matter what happened, and no matter how much the patient or their loved one tried to push them away, that embodied the spirit of Ruth. Then I began to see Ruth everywhere. In the way that I approached my own work as a chaplain at the hospital, in the internship that I went on to do in California at Chapman University, in my life as a Christian, I realized that Ruth's calling to Naomi was much like God's calling for all of us. See, Naomi tells Ruth that God has turned away from her. She believes she is somehow being punished, and as such doesn't deserve to have anyone stay with her. And she's lost absolutely everything. But when Ruth stays, it's not just so that Naomi isn't physically alone. Ruth stays to show Naomi that God has not abandoned her. I can't tell you how many times I heard and sensed that despair at the hospital. Just like Ruth, I was called to reassure my patients that God was still with them in the midst of their suffering. And just like Ruth, family and friends are called to reassure their loved ones of God's presence, that they are not alone. In this story, God is hidden from Naomi, but Ruth's commitment to stay reveals that God was always there. One of the other really unique parts of this story, for me, is that Ruth bears witness of God's presence to Naomi, even though Ruth and Naomi are of different cultures and of different religions. Naomi tells Ruth to go back to her people and her gods, meaning she had a different God. But she stays, and she said, no, I'm going to be with you and your people and your God too, away from my own family so that you are not alone. Naomi's loss of her husband and sons has left her completely marginalized by a society that has no place for widows and as a stranger in a foreign land. During Week of Compassion this year in February, if you can remember that far back, which for me is sometimes a little challenging, the theme came from this passage. You might have remembered seeing a poster hung up in the fellowship hall, and it had the verses 16 and 17 from this passage we read today. And the theme of thinking for Week of Compassion this year was thinking about the world refugee crisis and encouraging churches to think about how we are called to accompany the least of these, including refugees like Naomi and like the refugees that are flooding Europe and other parts of the world right now. And last fall, we were shocked by the picture of the little boy who had drowned in the Mediterranean Sea island Crete. And it's a shame that a picture like that, it took a picture like that to wake us up to the plight of the least of these in our world today. Even so, there are people in our country who would turn away refugees because of the color of their skin or the way that they worship God. And when I saw that the Week of Compassion materials used my favorite scripture along with the images of the refugee camps, I was excited to see the kind of reflection and meditation that might take place around thinking about the gifts that we give to Week of Compassion and all the ways they benefit folks around the world. The poster, if you don't remember it, had a picture of women and children in a refugee camp. The tent city was in the background. And it was a typical image that Week of Compassion might use to promote the work that they do and that our offering supports. But these women were wearing hijabs. And as many of you know, my senior ministry thesis talked about disciples' theology and of ecumenical and interfaith engagement. So as a part of this, I got a chance to talk to the director of Week of Compassion about the promotional materials and ask him how they were received and how churches might have been using them. And I was shocked, although I probably shouldn't have been, when he told me that there of the disciples' churches who had written angry emails and letters and phone calls about the presence of Muslim women on the poster for Week of Compassion this year. I know that Islamophobia and xenophobia runs deep in our country, but it still took me back. It made me wonder if the people who were writing knew the story of Ruth, because Ruth wasn't of the same faith tradition as Naomi. And when she stayed, she committed to accompanying Naomi despite this. If we can think forward to the New Testament, you might remember that Ruth is actually one of only 4 women listed in the genealogy of Jesus. Ruth is a part of a long legacy of people bearing God's light to others, even others who are different from them. It reminds me of the man on the road to Jericho who was beaten, and the Samaritan who stopped to help him after the man had been ignored by people of his own tradition. And like Ruth, the Samaritan accompanied the beaten man during his time of need and reminded him of God's presence and unfailing love. In many ways, we are called to be like Ruth. In the 3 years that I have been a part of this congregation, I have experienced the amazing ways that this church lives out its mission to be called to be the presence of Christ in our community. Through paths, the back-to-school fair, support of the orphanage and camp in Belarus, and in so many different ways, First Christian Church of Downers Grove bears God's light and divine presence to those that they lead. You have talked and studied and prayed about how to live into God's call for radical welcome here, and you acted on that. You welcomed Fe y Esperanza into your church and worship space and found ways to worship together across cultural and language differences. You chose to become an open and affirming and pro-reconciling anti-racism church. Some of these choices you've made are hard, and it's not easy to answer this call or even live it out. But you've continued to find ways to be Ruth. But we have to remember that to live out God's call, we have to keep staying. We have to keep journeying alongside each other. We have to hold each other and remind each other of God's love. In this congregation, we commit to walk alongside each other in our faith. When one of us has a need, we need to have someone be with us. In your workplaces, in your community, wherever you go, I charge you to search for ways to be Ruth for those who need someone to walk with them and be with them while they are at their lowest, sometimes most vulnerable selves, when they are Naomi. Because sometimes we're Naomi too. This space is sacred, and these people, you all are a holy people of God. And when you commit yourselves to each other, you make a covenant. And this rainbow behind me here bears witness to one particular covenant that you have made. But it's also a sign of a covenant that God made to each of us. A rainbow is a sign of hope and love. We see rainbows after storms, and we're reminded of God's commitment to us and God's presence with us, even in the midst of that storm. And this covenant is so holy. At the moment that Naomi felt completely abandoned and neglected by God and by a society that had no real place for her, Ruth declared to Naomi her commitment to stay with her. And Ruth didn't just bring herself. She brought the presence of the divine. And in our community here, we covenant to bear that divine light to each other in the midst of the darkness. To remind each other and to be reminded that we are not alone. We tell each other and those we are called to minister to, where you lead, I will follow. Anywhere that you tell me to. If you need me to be with you, I will follow where you lead.